When I went to school in a chemistry class, there was an experiment that I will never forget. The teacher had two test tubes, and both of them had a volume of 100 milliliters. That was the maximum capacity. And both of them were only filled up to that 1/2 mark. That means 50 milliliters each, with two fluids that looked like water, but weren't water, two different fluids. And the teacher poured the 50 milliliters from one test tube into the other one. And surprisingly, 50 plus 50, as you would assume mathematically, were not 100, but rather only 96 milliliters in total. Now, why is that the case? Well, nothing dripped out, nothing evaporated. There's no big trick behind it, but rather it's a very simple chemical explanation. Now, if you imagine that you have a big container, for instance, and there are big rocks, and there are smaller rocks, and possibly even smaller pebbles and sand. Interestingly, if we keep it simple, let's say they're big rocks and they're pebbles. If you put the pebbles in first, let's say 50 liters of pebbles, and then another 50 liters of big rocks, the total actually is, as you would assume mathematically, 100 liters. However, if you put the big rocks in first and pile them on top of each other, 50 liters, and then put 50 liters worth of pebbles in there, at least some of the pebbles will find their space in the gaps between the big rocks. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with effectiveness, with time management, increasing my productivity? Well, I could very simply say, start with the big rocks. Of course, the big rocks stand for the most important, the most valuable activities. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, and I can understand if that's your train of thought, well, how basic can he get with his tips? There's a little bit more depth to it than you might assume at this point. Because what happens if a particular individual has smaller and larger tasks that are supposed to get done? Well, let's say there's one very large task. Let's say there are 3 medium-sized tasks, and then there are 6 small tasks. So in total, there are 10 tasks. One really big rock, 3 medium ones, and 6 small tasks, pebbles, so to speak. What is the understandable and natural tendency that most human beings have? What do we tend to start with? Well, typically we tend to start with the small activities. Why is that? For purely psychological reasons, it appears to be more rewarding to check off quite a few items than to get the big important things done. So quite quickly you can check off, let's say 5 small items, and so you've completed half of your tasks very quickly. Well, mathematically that is true. You did complete 5 out of your total of 10 tasks, so those are half the tasks. But with respect to the effort, the time you need to put in, and also the value you've created, the benefits, the results you get, you most likely have not completed anything close to half of your activities. Well, numerically, yes, but not in terms of the results and the time it takes you to complete the tasks. So now, what is the problem with this? Theoretically, it doesn't make much of a difference in which order you complete your tasks as long as you get everything done. Well, what happens in practice? So let's say you believe that the big rock is going to take you 4 hours, and that all the 3 medium tasks and the 6 small tasks will take you a total of, as well, 4 hours. So let's assume that you have 8 hours. That could be 8 hours in one day, or it could be because you have some meetings here and there and other appointments, that those 8 hours are distributed over the course of, let's say, 2 work days. In any case, your total amount of time that is not planned so far is 8 hours, and your estimate is that it'll take you a total of 8 hours. Theoretically, it makes no difference what you start with. Let's say you start with all the small things and the medium things. So if you were planning 4 hours for the small and medium tasks, what happens in reality? Well, some things take longer, then other things come up, people interrupt you, you get an email, people come to you with something that's actually, or in that person's perception, important and urgent, and you don't actually complete all those tasks, at least not within the 4 hours that you'd originally planned. So it takes longer. So let's say the 4 hours turn into 6 hours. By the way, the average ratio between the amount of time somebody thought he or she would need for the task and the actual time that the person needs is about 1 to 2. That's not a hard and fast rule that is true in every situation or every person, but that's a general rule of thumb that on average things take twice as long as we thought. So let's say it doesn't take you 8 hours, which would be twice the 4 hours that you originally planned, but rather only 6 hours, including all the interruptions and the things that the unplanned tasks, topics that came up. So back to our example, let's say you had a total of 8 hours. You've used up 6 hours, so you only have 2 hours left for the big rock. Now, the tendency typically will be not to start with the big rock because you know that you only have 2 hours and it would take you at least 4 hours. Realistically speaking, it'll probably take 5 or 6 hours. So if you did start, you'll have one of two disadvantages. Either you start and you actually complete it, but it'll take you significantly longer than you planned to put in, more hours than you planned to put in on that particular day, or you start but you have to interrupt it right in the middle, right when you got into the details, and go home with the not so optimal feeling of, I started the biggest task, I started the biggest rock, but I was not able to complete it. So now there's Zach Davis coming over and says, well, why don't you just start with the big rocks? Now, I do realize that very rarely you will have 4 or even 6 hours without an interruption to complete the whole big rock in this example. However, it might be useful to start at least part of the big rock as your first activity early in the morning. But before we look at that, let's continue our example. Let's say your big rock, you start with your big rock, and it takes you not 4 hours, but 6 hours. I'm assuming the same ratio, 4 to 6 or 2 to 3, 50% longer as I did for the small and medium topics. So here again, after completing that part, that means the big rock, there are 2 hours left. Those 2 hours will be sufficient, most likely, to take care of the 3 medium topics and let's say a couple of small topics. That means, if my math is correct, there are 4 small items left. If you're just slightly lucky, and the likelihood is very, very high, at least one of those small items will take care of itself because somebody else took care of it or it just became obsolete in the meantime. So now the question is, what is better? Is it better to have 3 small topics left over, or is it better to have 1 big rock left over? It depends on the particular situation, but in most cases, I believe it's much better if the 3 small items are left over than if the big rock is left over, because it's much easier to get the small tasks done in a small period of time. You don't need a big time that you've blocked. Possibly you can delegate it if you have people that you can delegate to. Possibly something else becomes obsolete. In any case, it's easier to plan 3 small chunks of time than 1 really big chunk of time. One more aspect I indicated already, and that is that I said I realized that you rarely have 4 or even 6 hours to complete a really big rock, a big task at once. But it might be useful to start with at least part of a big rock as your first item early in the morning. Why is that? Well, depending on when you start your workday, let's say you start at 8 o'clock, well, typically that first hour before 9 a.m., now it depends on the industry and the organization and when your colleagues and your clients typically start working, but usually the time before 9 o'clock, as a general rule of thumb, is much quieter, has a lot less interruptions for you and other people, and is the best opportunity throughout the course of a typical workday to complete something with as few interruptions as possible. So you might want to think about the question, what the first activity is that you conduct every morning. When I ask participants in seminars or other events what the first thing is they do when they get to the office, now besides the coffee and possibly going to the restroom in whatever order, is that the first thing they do is they check their emails. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong. All I'm saying is you might want to question whether that is the best use of your first half an hour, or whether it would possibly be a much better use of your time to spend the first half an hour or hour, of course, depending on when you start in the morning, depending on whether you start at 6, 7, 8, or whenever you start in the morning, whether it might not be the best use of your time to not check your emails, but rather to at least start, possibly even complete a major big rock. Sometimes, actually quite often, anti-cyclical behavior can be very useful for your productivity. What I'm referring to is it might be useful to think about starting your workday earlier than so far and ending it earlier. Obviously, this is not supposed to end in you starting 2 hours earlier and ending 2 hours later, but rather starting earlier and ending earlier, or possibly that's second best in my opinion, starting later and ending later. What is the point? The number of hours is the same. Well, I'm sure you've made the observation that typically the hours you put in very early before most of your colleagues arrive at the office, or the typical workday starts for most people, and the hours on the other end towards the end of the workday or past or after the typical end of a workday are those hours, those times that are most productive. Now, I realize that it might not be practical for you personally to actually change your work schedule. Possibly you're not even able to choose, and you're bound to, let's say you work in a bank or a store, and you need to be there during regular opening hours of the shop or the bank, etc. And possibly, in theory, it would be great to start at 7 o'clock in the morning, but in reality, at 8 or 8:30, you take your kid or kids to school or kindergarten, and you just simply can't start any earlier. However, I do want to tell you a little bit of a story. A participant in a seminar said that she, and this is representative of things that a lot of people have told me, and that is this woman said that she used to work from 8 to 4 o'clock. And she decided to, and she could do that, there was no reason not to do it for her personally. She said she was an early riser anyhow. She decided to work from 6 to 2 o'clock instead. So the same number of hours, but simply 2 hours earlier. And I asked her what the influence was on her performance, her productivity, and she said, you know what, I get twice as much done as I used to get done. Now, I said to her, I'm not quite sure, is it really twice as much? And she insisted that she was at least twice as productive. Concretely, she said, what I get done between 6 o'clock and 8:30 in the morning is more than I used to get done throughout the whole day. Now, I don't know whether I want to take this literally, but that doesn't matter anyhow. Whether her actual increase in productivity was 10% or 50% or possibly 100% if you really take it literally, doesn't really matter. That's not the point. The point is it is an increase in productivity, at least for her, and it can be useful to think about working in an anti-cyclical way. You might also do it indirectly by, now this of course depends on whether your boss is or the organization is okay with this, spending some time working at home. Now, assuming that at home you can work with fewer interruptions than in the office, depending on how many kids you have and how many other people live in your household, of course. But it can be useful to possibly spend one day a week or the afternoons or spend individual half days or days on a non-regular basis at home when you want to get something really important done. Very often there is the opportunity to do so. Working anti-cyclically could also simply mean that you take your task at hand and just go someplace else physically, not only home, but to an empty office of a colleague who's not there at the time, and physically remove yourself from your typical workspace, remove yourself from your desk, if possible, if it makes sense with respect to this particular task, and go someplace else in order to have fewer interruptions and to simply get something done. Checklists can be very useful. When are checklists useful? When is it appropriate to use checklists? Well, especially if a particular task recurs regularly or irregularly. Regularly would be every day, every week, every month, every year, especially for things that happen only once per year. So the time gap's pretty large. It can be very, very useful to use checklists because often when you figured out how to do something and then it's a full year until you do it again. And at least speaking for myself, I often don't know how exactly I did it a year before if I didn't take notes. What are the advantages of checklists? Well, the main advantage is, one advantage is that you don't forget anything. Well, that's the case with any form of notes, if you can find your notes, of course that is. Another advantage is, I believe, that you are faster if you have a checklist. Let's say you have a checklist as to which things need to be done before you go on vacation, in your office or even at home. But let's refer to the office. And you have 8 things on your list, and you go through it and you go, that I've done it, done, done, done. Oh, forgot that, need to get it done, 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 forgot that, done, and you finished your list. You're much, much faster in a lot of situations. You can also use checklists to give an order. What I mean by that is not to give somebody else an order, but rather to define the order, the sequence in which something needs to be done. Not always, but often the order in which things are done is important. And then you can also use checklists when working with other people. For instance, if people come to you with a certain type or category of problems frequently, it can be very useful to say something like, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. I have, however, created a checklist, and please go through these 4 points as an example, and check these 4 areas or these 4 aspects. Go through these 4 steps before you call me, but if it can't be resolved within these 4 subtopics or these 4 steps, then please call me and I'll be very happy to answer any question you have. I've seen IT departments, for instance, that had or created a very, very short checklist. It could be as short as, before you call us, restart your computer and check whether the problem is still there, and experience that they have 30 to 50% fewer calls or other inquiries about technical problems. That's how powerful a checklist can be when you're working with other people. So you can use checklists for yourself, but also when working with other people. Colors can be used not only to make life more colorful, but as an organizing principle and as a means to create a better overview. Let's start with a very simple example. Let's say you have a whole wall full of folders. And let's say there's a total of, let's say, 100 folders. And they are organized by colors. let's say there are 5 different colors. There's red folders, blue folders, green, yellow, and maybe white, for instance. And you know that the document you're looking for is in one of the, let's say, blue folders. So out of the 100 folders, let's say 20 are blue. And all you need to do is search within the blue area, the blue categories. And even if the folders are not categorized by colors, that means all the blue folders are in one particular subset of this area, but rather randomly distributed, which is unlikely, it's easy to solve. But let's say that was the case, even then, at worst, you have to look at the 20 folders until you've found the correct one and not all 100. So it simply saves time. It's a natural recognition pattern. Colors are a very natural pattern of recognition. Now, how can we use colors to our advantage besides using colors for various different physical folders? Well, for instance, I use colors within my calendar. I personally use Outlook, but I'm not saying that that's necessarily a recommendation or not. Within my calendar in Outlook, what I do is I have particular appointments in particular colors. So, for instance, I have speaking engagements, seminars, and larger events in one particular color. It happens to be green in that case. I have train trips in red. I have flights in blue, et cetera, et cetera. There's about 5, 6 colors that I use. And then, of course, there are appointments that don't have any colors that don't fit into a category. What's the point of this? Well, let's say I am planning a week, and I'm trying to plan which activities I can possibly do on the plane, for instance, reading activities, reading a book or proofreading or whatever. And there are other activities, for instance, those that require an internet connection that I can do on the train fairly well. There are other activities that I need to do in the office. I just can't do them on the road because they involve other people, for instance, that I need to meet with directly. Or I need to be on the phone, which is quite inconvenient. It doesn't work on the plane typically, or it's very expensive to do so. And on the train is often also not optimal. So to keep the example fairly short, it's very helpful when planning or organizing a day, a week, or a month. Usually for me the unit is the week. Now you might be thinking, but yeah, I see that there's a benefit in having colors, different colors in your calendar, different types of appointments in different colors, but it seems to be quite cumbersome to take every individual appointment and define a category and therefore a color. Well, there's an easier way of doing it. Most calendar programs provide the opportunity to define that if a certain word is in the appointment, like it says the word flight, that the program automatically turns it into a particular category and therefore a particular defined color. So for me personally, if the word flight is in my calendar, it will automatically turn blue. No particular reason behind it, maybe because the biggest German airline is blue and yellow. But there's no big reasoning or logic or color psychology behind it. In any case, since I've defined that whenever it says seminar, let's say, or it says speech or something like that, or one of my topics, power reading or time management, that the color green comes up, that happens automatically. So I'd like to encourage you to think about where there are places where you could use colors to your advantage. It could be the colors of a traffic light, red, yellow, green, depending on importance or urgency of a task, or indicating whether a particular task has not been started, has been started but not completed, or has been completed. I, for instance, use colors, not very many, just a couple of colors, in my inbox. For instance, for emails where the topic is still open, it's not resolved, but I can't do anything because the ball is in somebody else's court. I still want to have it in my inbox in the main folder and not in the subfolders, but I don't want to have to reread the email over again just to realize, oh, no, I can't do anything right now because the ball is in somebody else's park. So I use a color, in that case it's a reddish color, and it moves to the bottom to indicate that it's still open, but I can't do anything right now. I'm waiting for somebody else's response or waiting for the other person to complete a task. And I have a different color. In that case, it's a bluish color that indicates that the ball is in my park, but I can't do it on the road. It's something I need to do when I'm in the office. So again, just another example as to how you can use colors to your advantage. Birds of a feather flock together. What does that have to do with time management? Well, a very basic organizing principle, and that is to avoid doing one thing that is unrelated to the next thing that you jump to and unrelated to the next thing. That means answering an email here, returning a phone call here, doing something, filling in some form as a next activity, and so on and so forth. And of course I realize that sometimes this is not avoidable. Now, what is the recommendation? That is, as well as possible, to try and create blocks of activity. That could be based on the medium, that means an email block, a phone block, etc. It could also mean that you create an activity block that is topic or client specific. Everything has to do with the client A first, then everything has to do with client B, everything has to do with client C. What's the advantage? Well, when you avoid jumping from one type of category to another, you simply lose less time. That's similar to picture an production or assembly line. Let's say an automobile manufacturer. Typically, the automobile manufacturer will not produce one model of a car and then change everything around and produce a totally different model of the same brand, and then change everything around to produce, again, a totally different model or model of that particular brand. And as I said, it's not always avoidable 100%, but the better you create meaningful blocks of activity, the less time you end up losing. And another advantage is that if you define a time slot for a particular block of activity, you will rarely define a point in time when that is not useful or doesn't make any sense for that type of activity. I'll give you an example. Let's say there are 10 people you need to call. And let's say you get to your office early in the morning at 6:30 a.m. Well, you probably will not plan your 1 hour on the phone trying to reach those 10 people from 6:30 to 7:30 a.m. You will automatically put that block at, define a period of time that is most reasonable, most sensible for that type of activity. Things that involve communication, you will typically plan during times when you tend to get interrupted more often and can reach other people more easily as well. Goes in both directions. And you will plan activities during which you don't want to be interrupted, or ideally are not interrupted during times that tend to be quieter. Early in the morning, possibly during the midday break. If you change your midday break around a little bit, that would be another form of anti-cyclical behavior. You taking your lunch break a little bit earlier or a little bit later than most other people do, or at the end of the day when things start getting quieter. The controversial topic of multitasking. Well, my suggestion is to save as much time as possible by simply not multitasking. Now, what is the opposite? Because very often when people go to time management seminars or read a book on the topic, they'll encounter, at some point, they'll encounter the statement of, don't multitask, but very rarely does the faculty, the trainer, the speaker, the author say explicitly what the opposite is. Now, we could call it monotasking, single tasking, but what does that really mean? Well, it means to focus at one thing at a time. That sounds simpler than it often is in reality. But to focus on one thing at a time, that means, if we look at it a different way around, that means to not concentrate, to ignore everything else on a practical and mental level that does not relate to that particular task. And then once you're finished with that task, whether it's a 10-second task, 10-minute task, or a 3-hour task, then fairly quickly to switch to the next task and leave the other one behind you. Another way of looking at it is to concentrate on the present. Now, this sounds simpler than it is, and possibly it sounds somewhat philosophical, but concentrating on the subject matter at hand means that you are in the present, concentrating on the present activity, and not thinking about what you're going to do next, or what you're planning, or what you fear, or what you need to do in the future. But concentrating on the present, which also means not concentrating on things that are in the past that you can't change anyhow. So fully focusing on the topic at hand right now in this moment. And that requires practice. And very often when I talk about single tasking or concentrating on one particular topic versus multitasking, somebody in the audience says, sometimes it's a woman, sometimes it's a man, says, but women can do two things at once better than men can. Is that true or is it not? Well, just a little bit of a side note. If you'd like to put your two fists next to each other, I want you to do that, and take a good look at your two fists. That's roughly the size of your brain. And well, for some people, that's a very positive statement because they have very large fists. Other people start doubting themselves. A while back, somebody wanted to signal how big his brain is, and somebody else said, yeah, it's really big, but look how hollow it is inside. So anyhow, those two halves of your brain, no matter whether you're male or female, are connected through something that's called the corpus callosum, or however you pronounce it in Latin with an American accent. Anyhow, it seems to be the case, not all scientists are of this opinion, but it seems to be the case that the exchange of information between these two halves of the brain on average works a little bit better for females than for males. So it seems to be that when activities require both halves of the brain, that women, ladies, are slightly at an advantage. In any case, no matter how big your brain is, how well the two halves of the brain are connected, I strongly recommend to save time by not multitasking, but rather, as well as possible, getting used to concentrating at one thing at a time. What is the value of an hour of your time? You might be surprised by this question, but often it is very useful with respect to increasing your productivity and your time management to put an euro or dollar or yen or whatever it is, whatever your currency is, value to your time. What's the point of doing that? Well, you will increase your awareness with respect to your consciousness with respect to how you spend your time. So let's say an hour of your time is worth X, let's say, dollars. What's the advantage? Well, let's say if you know that an hour of your time is worth X dollars, and a particular activity would take 3 hours to complete it, you'll start asking yourself questions like, would we as an organization be willing to spend 3 times X dollars to get this activity finished. And there's a certain percentage of activities where you realize that it's just not worth your time. It does give you somewhat of a benefit, or the organization somewhat of a benefit, but it's just not worth it if you look at the actual cost indirectly through time that is associated with it. Or let's say you're in a meeting with 10 other people, and let's say depending on who is there, of course, you have a lot of executives there or not, how many people are there. I gave you an example of 10 people. It's no hard and fast rule. But let's say the cumulative value of an hour, or the cost associated with this group of people meeting is, let's say, and that's probably conservative, $600. That means that every minute costs $10. Now, if people are aware of that, there's a good chance that fewer minutes will be wasted. So the point is, if you put an hourly value to an hour of your time, or an hour of other people's time, or to the completion of a particular task, you much more consciously think about ways to optimize it and often question whether this is a good use of your time. Just in case you're looking for a very, very rough rule of thumb to calculate how much an hour of your time is worth or costs, it's easier to look at it in terms of costs. What you could do is you could take your annual gross salary and divide it by 1,000. So if you're earning, let's say, X $1,000 gross salary per year, then X is roughly, just roughly, your hourly value, or the cost that your employer has to employ you for 1 hour. The logic behind it, as I said, it's no perfect formula, but it's a good approximation. The logic behind it is, if you take the amount of time that you work, the number of hours you work in a year, and assume that it's about 2,000 hours, that again is not totally correct. If you don't do any overtime, it's a chunk less. But let's say it's 2,000 hours. Then you would take your gross salary and divide it by 2,000. But of course, your employer has other costs associated with your salary, direct costs and indirect costs. And depending on how the controlling division of your organization tends to calculate, often this is multiplied roughly by 2. And of course, if you divide by 2,000 and multiply by 2, that's the same thing mathematically as if you simply took your gross salary and divided it by 1,000. As I said a few times, it's not a perfect formula, but it's good enough to fulfill the main purpose, namely to increase your awareness with respect to how you how you spend your time and where you could possibly save time. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk to you about orderliness. Now, there might be topics that appear to be more interesting than keeping things in order. The question I'd like to ask is, what is the purpose of keeping things in order, whatever that means in particular situations? Well, I don't think it's about the orderliness itself, but rather the result thereof, namely reducing the amount of time it takes you to search for things, information, searching for physical items. So if you have an organizing system within a particular area of your life or work life that leads to you're not very often having to search for any noticeable amount of time, then it seems that your organizing principle, your organizational system in this sub-area is quite a good system. If, however, there's a particular area, whether it's your emails, whether it's physical documents, whether it's information in files and electronic files, or anything else where you, on average, it takes you quite a while to find things, or at least often it takes you quite a bit of time to find the right thing, there's a good chance that it's worth rethinking your system. And there's a reason why typically in most households, that is, you don't have to spend a lot of time looking for a fork or a spoon or a knife. Why is that? Well, because there's a couple very, very simple basic principles. That your utensils are always kept in a particular room, and they are kept in a particular drawer of this particular room, the kitchen usually. And within the drawer, you keep knives in a certain place, you keep spoons in a particular place, and you keep forks in a particular place. Now, I'm not saying that everything has to be organized neatly and perfectly, but there is a correlation between how good is your system and how much time do you spend, or I could say waste, searching for information or physical items. And there's an interesting expression, at least in German, maybe there's something similar in English or in other languages, and I don't know where it's from exactly, otherwise I would cite the source. And that is, if you have time to search, you have time to keep order. Now, and I'd like to add, that's sort of an addition from my side, the advantage of keeping things in order and putting the time into keeping things in order compared to spending time searching for things is that for the former, with the former, you can choose when you're going to do it. When you urgently need something and you don't know where it is, you're forced to spend your time searching for it. So keeping things in order is a little bit of a contribution towards creating more time freedom and having more control over what you do when, and not being forced to do something in particular at a certain point in time.